Good day, everyone. Today, we will tackle about the neurofunctional theory. But before we begin, we'll introduce ourselves first.
I am Angel Pangdo.
I am Jennifer Seneca.
I am Fraji Adiwang.
And I am Megan Pellejera. So now, we'll begin our discussion by knowing who is Joseph Lamandela first. Are you familiar with him? If not, then we'll give a simple background of him. Joseph Lamandela is one of the forefathers of the neurofunctional theory of second language acquisition. He proposed this theory based from his work entitled as the Neurofunctional Basis of Pattern Practice in 1979 in TESOL Quarterly. He stated that this theory explains language acquisition using neurolinguistic terms as well as neurolinguistic perspective on language that attempts to characterize the neurolinguistic information processing system that's responsible for the development and the use of language. Then, it is said that the neurofunctional activities are based on sub-processes which takes charge of a specific piece of language itself. Next, the neurofunctional theory accounts of second language acquisition recognize the contribution of both the left and right hemisphere of the brain, which will be discussed subsequently.
Let us now discuss the different function of the right and left hemisphere of the brain. In neurofunctional theory, Lamandela mentioned the function of the right and left hemisphere of the brain and its relation to language acquisition. In this theory, it states that acquisition of the second and foreign language is mainly the product of neural and brain-based processes. Lamandela also believes that the right and left hemisphere of the brain is firmly related to the comprehension and production of language. Both hemisphere of the brain also accounts for age differences, formulaic speech, fossilization, and the pattern practice in the second language acquisition. Thus, language functioning is also dependent on the brain activity, particularly on the left hemisphere of the brain. So what are the different functions of the right and left hemisphere of the brain? In neurofunctional theory, the right hemisphere of the brain is for holistic processing. It perceives and remembers. Holistic processing is the reason why we can recognize faces and objects by their features. It also stores and processes formulaic speech and its constituents, namely routines and patterns. Some examples of formulaic speech are idioms, rhymes, prayers, songs, and proverbs. The right hemisphere is also involved in the pattern practice in the classroom second language acquisition, since it arranges them for the later left hemisphere examination. In relation to the right hemisphere, Ellis stated that the participation of the right hemisphere in second language acquisition will most likely to occur in the early stages of acquisition, since the brain intensifies the use of formulaic speech. Meanwhile, the left hemisphere of the brain is for analytical processing, linear thinking, rational thinking, sequential thinking, and analytical thinking. It is also where reading language and motor operations are located, which affects our speaking and writing. Left hemispheres also associated to the creative language, with the use of both syntactic and semantic processing. Moreover, according to the research conducted by Cannon in 1992, it was hypothesized that both hemispheres of the brain operates together, wherein second language learner with left dominance tend to be field independent and prefer a deductive style of learning, while those with right dominance, they tend to be field dependent and prefer an inductive style of learning. And that's the end of my discussion about the different function of the right and left hemisphere of the brain. Let us now go to the next part of our report, which is types of language acquisition. Miss Freddy?
Thank you for that wonderful explanation of the left and right hemisphere of the brain, Miss Jennifer. I am going to discuss the types of language acquisition. According to Lamandela, there are two types of language acquisition. We have the primary language acquisition and the non-primary language acquisition. Under the non-primary language acquisition, we have two subtypes. These are foreign language learning and secondary language acquisition. Moving on to the next slide, I am going to differentiate primary language acquisition from non-primary language acquisition. Primary language acquisition is when the child's acquisition is one or more native languages, taking approximately at 2 to 5 years of age in the context of progressive maturation. When we say progressive maturation, it is when a child is proceeding step by step to maturity. Primary language acquisition becomes difficult to achieve outside of a critical period. Critical period ends at 9 to 13 years of age. We say critical period because it is when a child feels difficulty in achieving another language aside from his native language. Now that we have defined primary language acquisition, let us proceed to the non-primary language acquisition. Non-primary language acquisition is an adult's acquisition of a normative language after the period of primary language acquisition. So, non-primary language acquisition is characterized by the progression of interlanguages. By means of progression of interlanguages, we mean the process of developing the type of language or linguistic system that second and foreign language learning use. Non-primary language acquisition becomes more difficult to achieve outside of a sensitive period, which ends at approximately 13 years of age. Now that we have finished differentiating the primary language acquisition from non-primary language acquisition, I am now going to present to you the two subtypes of non-primary language acquisition. First, we have the foreign language learning. Foreign language learning happens in a formal classroom setting. Foreign language learning leads to target language communication skills marked by cognition hierarchy as the basis of learning and speech performance. Frequent conscious direction of target language speech performance and the use of translation buffers to map between native language and the interlanguage. Moving on, secondary language acquisition uses a naturalistic setting, or wherein you can relax and not worry about the rules that are used in a formal classroom setting. Secondary language acquisition target language communication skills marked by communication hierarchy as the basis of learning and speech performance. Second, the use of interlanguage. By interlanguage, we mean the type of language or linguistic system that second and foreign language learning use. Thirdly is the absence of translation buffers. And lastly, the automatic access of interlanguage grammatical and semantic knowledge without the need for conscious direction. That would be the end of my report. Now, let us hear from Miss Angel what neurofunctional systems is.
The neurofunctional theory doesn't only present the types of language acquisition, but it also presents the neurofunctional system. Neurofunctional system is a general term referring to the result of the interaction of the neural system of the brain and the environmental condition. The two types of language acquisition possess different neurofunctional systems, which in turn hold a variety of functions and contribute to information processing. Lamandela had also conceptualized networks of knowledge as vertical hierarchies of neurofunctional system. The two major hierarchies involved in information processing, which are also called the networks of knowledge, are the communication hierarchy and the cognition hierarchy. The communication hierarchy is involved in the acquisition of both the primary language acquisition and the secondary language acquisition. It consists all the sub-processes taking place during interpersonal to monitor language use. This hierarchy is also responsible for language and other forms on interpersonal communication. Meanwhile, the cognition hierarchy is involved in learning, which is the foreign language learning. It consists of the combination of the sub-processes which analyze and synthesize information. This is highly influential in acquiring language because it is through comprehension that it can actually be applied. This theory also controls the cognition information and processing activities which are also part of language use. Remember that these networks of knowledge develops as the neural systems of infants become mature. In relation to communication hierarchy, according to Elise, the two systems of language functioning can be divided into high and low level systems. The high level systems is for obtaining second language forms, which can be accumulated as subroutines at the lower level of the communication hierarchy, while the low level systems is for performance. Lower level subroutines may be approached without referring to the higher level of the same hierarchy. That's all for neurofunctional system. Now let's have Megan to summarize what neurofunctional theory is.
As a conclusion, neurofunctional theory argues that there is a connection between language function and neutral anatomy. This precisely elaborates the internal neurofunctional capacity that's responsible for the information acquired. Then, neurofunctional theory considers the involvement of the left and right hemisphere of the brain that is related to the comprehension and production of language. Moreover, this theory focuses on specific aspects of second language acquisition such as age difference, formulaic speech, fossilization, and pattern practice. Furthermore, the second language acquisition can be explained neurofunctionally with reference to which neurofunctional system is used in either communication or cognitive, to what level the neurofunctional system is engaged. However, there is an issue on this theory since neurofunctional theory states that neural systems specific to language are to some extent innate and genetically programmed. Yet, critics have disagreed and believe that the perspective of this theory is not exclusive for language learning, but an attempt to formulate more global theory for human capacity to learn. Thank you for listening.